Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Jennifer Dill, Director of the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University, and I will be introducing and moderating today's seminar. Our Friday Transportation Seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. These seminars are usually held live on Portland State University's urban campus, located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kailapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important that we acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place, remember these communities, and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Due to the COVID pandemic, today's seminar is hosted fully online, but later on in the spring term, we will be going back to our hybrid format and having, our plan is to have some of our seminars on campus. So stay tuned for more about that. Whoops, sorry, scrolling too quickly here. I am very excited today to have with us Madeline Brozen presenting on addressing gendered harassment and women's travel needs. Madeline Brozen is the Deputy Director for the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies at UCLA. Her research focuses on transportation needs for priority populations and how transportation can enable increased access to opportunity. She has a background in GIS and remote sensing, enjoys using a variety of different research methods and working to ensure that research can help advance progressive policy. Before we jump into Madeline's presentation, I'm going to share information about a couple upcoming TREC events. The first is our workshop for faculty about integrating bike and pedestrian topics into university curriculum. There are links to these on our website, and we do post the slides later if you want additional information, but this will be available June 21st and 22nd. And then we are also opening up recruitment for our Transportation Undergraduate Research Fellowship Program this summer. So we are back on campus doing this event. And we invite, if you are an undergraduate student, we invite you to apply, or if you know an undergraduate student who would be interested in spending some time in Portland doing transportation research, we encourage you to go to the website and learn more about that. So before we jump into the seminar, a little bit of instructions on how things work, though I'm sure by this time most of you are familiar. Our speaker will present for about 40 minutes, followed by question and answer. You do need to put your questions in the Q&A feature on the control panel, and we'll be asking them, I will be asking them at the end of the presentation. If we do run out of time for questions, we do share them with our speaker afterwards, but hopefully we can fit them all in today. We have enabled a closed captioning, but you must click on the CC feature on your control panel to view them. And as usual, we are recording the seminar. We will post the link to it, the recording later on today, along with a link to the presentation slides. So you can share that with your colleagues and others. And then again, if you are tracking professional development hours, it is eligible for 1 hour of credit. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I am going to turn it over to Madeline Brozen.
Great, thank you so much, Jennifer. Let me go ahead and share my slides and we'll get started. I want to thank, perfect. I want to thank Portland State for inviting me to present today. And just to get a sense of who's in the room, we're going to launch a couple of polls to kind of see. So we'll go that. And as those are launching, so the first, just kind of for my helpfulness as a speaker, curious about what sector or primary kind of occupation that you identify with. I understand that, especially students may also have other roles, but just to get a sense of that, we'll let you answer that question. And great. Let people answer that. As that's going on, we'll kind of have those in the background. Let me just jump in, to kind of what I hope that everyone gets a sense of in terms of today's takeaways, kind of the broad things that I'll be speaking to. I'll have a second poll. Perfect. Great. Glad to see there are so many people from the public sector. I think that there's a real opportunity for our transportation industry to really address this. The second question is just going to ask how you identify in terms of your gender, since that's really what we're talking about today. So the 4 takeaways that I want to talk through. The first one is that, really going to be talking about research that we did about public transit use. And I think the broad point of this is that public transit use requires people to feel comfortable on transit and in public. So there's a lot of issues that relate to experiences on public transit that really apply very broadly in terms of comfort in public spaces. The second point is that harassment really shapes people's behaviors and perceptions. The third, which I'll kind of touch on more towards the end, as I bring in a couple of other projects that I've been involved in, is that not just gender, but gender, race, and income collectively shape people's mobility and also do so in uneven ways. And then the fourth point to kind of think about is that a lot of the what we see kind of in transportation are really related to societal things, kind of societal patterns. And transportation in of itself cannot solve the transportation patterns, but it can but it can really work to address them. So I also want to give a content warning that throughout today's talk, I will be discussing issues relating to sexual harassment and sexual assault. So today I'm going to be talking through 4 different projects that I've had the opportunity to be involved in. I've not at all done this alone. I've had a really great cadre of collaborators. At UCLA, I primarily work with 2 professors in urban planning, Anastasia Lukaitu-Sedaris and Evelyn Blumenberg. And then on the LA Metro and LA DOT studies, which are at the end of this slide, there's a whole cadre of consultant teams from Farron Peers and from KDI, as well as other collaborators that have really helped in these efforts. So I'll primarily focus on this first image, which is a technical report titled Public Transit Safety Among University Students. That was really what we're going to dive into in terms of the LA data. This was actually part of a global study, and you can find all of that work in this book from Rutledge, Transit Crime and Sexual Violence in Cities. And then we've really been fortunate in LA to have both our transit agency, LA Metro, tackle this on the report Understanding How Women Travel, and our local Department of Transportation, LA DOT, which released the Changing Lanes, a Gender Equity and Transportation Study. At the end of this, I'll throw links to all of these into the chat. To situate us kind of in terms of what sexual harassment is, I want to provide a couple of definitions. So sexual harassment is any unwanted attention, including lewd comments, leering, sexual invitations, threats, displaying pornographic material, being followed or pictured, and public masturbation as examples. And sexual assault refers to situations where someone is threatened, coerced, or forced into non-consensual sexual acts. And these come from that citation there. Sexual harassment can happen in a number of different ways. And I think this is a really useful categorization to kind of understand this. And I'll touch back on this in our survey results, kind of how we put these into categories. Sexual harassment can be verbal, That's probably, the most common, and it's definitely what we heard from our respondents, that it was the most common thing that happened. So catcalls, whistling, obscene language, sexual comments or invitations. It can be nonverbal, so staring or watching people taking pictures of others, indecent exposure, public masturbation or stalking, being followed, or it can be physical. So that's more so in the category of sexual assault, but not exclusively. There can be obviously harassment behaviors, like just touching, groping, pulling hair, that nature. So we really want to understand more about what are the experiences relating to sexual harassment on public transit. And to address these questions, we conducted an online survey of university students who ride public transportation. We worked with the transportation departments at 3 different universities, and actually distributed the survey to students who hold transit passes. We focus on university students first and foremost as a way of access. University researchers have access to university students, but also university students are more likely to ride public transit. They're more likely to have low incomes and rely on public transit because they don't have other options. And it's a group that really, you think about, there's kind of life patterns. So if you take transit earlier in life, you're more likely to take it later. So in our survey, we're really broadly looking at 3 questions. What are transit safety concerns and victimization experiences? And how do people react to those concerns? And how do those trends vary? Do students feel the need to take precautions relating to sexual harassment and assault? And how do these harassment experiences shape their mobility? And then to the response, what are promising strategies to combat sexual harassment and increase safety in the public transit journey? As I mentioned, this survey was conducted among a global network of researchers. So this map is showing all of the places where the survey was done. So we had 4 sites in North America: Vancouver, San Jose, and Los Angeles in California, and Mexico City. We had 3 sites in South America: Bogota, Rio Claro, and Sao Paulo in Brazil. A number of sites in Western Europe. We had a team that conducted the survey in Africa, 3 researchers in Asia, and a research team in Australia. What's really powerful about this is that the exact same survey was administered in all of these places. The only exception to that was that some demographic questions differed based on appropriateness in those areas. For example, we asked demographic questions about sexual orientation and identity. Those were not asked in the African study. Their survey was pretty long, and I really want to thank all of our respondents who took the time to answer it. We asked about feelings and experiences really at a very specific level. So we walked through a series of experiences people may have had as they relate to, do they happen on the bus or they happen on the rail? And we asked people, do you take these modes? We also asked whether they've experienced them at day or night, and where in the transit journey. So did it happen on the way to or from? Did it happen while waiting, or did it happen on the vehicle? Following that section of the survey, we asked about precautions that people need to take. And again, we asked very specifically about some of those precautions. Then we asked if people had experienced sexual harassment or assault, whether they reported that. If they did report, who did they report to? And if they didn't report, why not? And then these series of demographic questions. In our Los Angeles study, we collected about 1,300 surveys from students at 3 campuses. So as UCLA, Cal State LA, which is northeast of downtown, and Cal State Northridge, which is in the San Fernando Valley. Our respondents were predominantly female, which is not unexpected given that this issue affects women more than men. And we had a small sample of transgender or people that said they did not identify with the categories and prefer not to say. I will just note that the findings are going to show the female and male because the people that did not identify as either of these is such a small group. And this is really important to really dig into. And I want to acknowledge that Amy Lubito at Portland State has done great work into the transgender community and experiences on public transit. We had a fairly diverse race ethnicity that fairly accurately matched the students at these campuses. We had a 16% response rate among people who identify as LGBTQ. Most of those were women. Most of our respondents were between the ages of 18 to 29. A small portion was older, but it was just in the next kind of decade. And I think that what's really powerful is that because we really selected for people that rode public transit, we had people who experienced this a lot. So most of the sample used the bus, a lot of the sample used the the subway. But most of these were frequent transit riders. Based on the geography of the campuses, more of them were frequent bus riders, but some of them used the train in part of their transit journey to campus or just otherwise in travel. We didn't specifically ask about whether experiences happened during the transit commute to campuses. It was just about their experiences in general on transit. Okay, so now with that part, I want to dig into what we found. So first, this graph is showing the perceptions of safety using the bus during the day. And you can see that about a third of all of the students felt always safe using the bus during the day, but already we're starting to see some gender differences. Is that once you go down to sometimes, you're having actually already kind of a quarter of people only sometimes feeling safe during the day. But there was also very differences among racial and ethnic groups. And you can see that white students were most likely to report that they always or often felt safest during using the bus during the day. And that Black students were more likely to respond that only sometimes they felt safe during the day. As you would expect, things changed a lot at night. When we had before that, about a third of people always felt safe, this dropped to only 8% of students that felt safe using the bus after dark. We saw more women that had less feelings of safety. And then you can see that there is a constraining of mobility, that 10% of the people that responded said they did not use the bus after dark. Now I'll come back to this in terms of the precautions. There's questions of like when I've done work with older adults, they kind of say, well, we don't go out at night because there's nothing to do. So we can't say whether they didn't use the bus after dark because it was a safety concern, or it's just they weren't using transit at night. I do want to put these findings from Los Angeles in context with the other cities where the survey was done. So you can see that Los Angeles is situated towards the bottom, that students in Stockholm, Tokyo, and Paris had the highest percentage of feeling always or often safe after dark. And you might think, oh, this is because transit may come much more frequently. But if you think about Mexico City, which also has a very frequent transit network and service, they're actually on the lowest. So there's a lot of differences in terms of these cities. But what is the kind of cross-cutting, most like with the exception of Manila, is that women felt less safe after dark than men. And so, we asked what is your perception of safety? And then we also asked, have you experienced specific behaviors? And the point here I want to make is that perceptions really did match people's victimization experiences. So this chart shows the percentage of students who experienced some form of sexual harassment or assault while using transit. And we didn't just ask, have you done this? We had this list, these are some of the ones that I'm showing here, of all of these discrete experiences they might have encountered while on transit. And that even men, 50% of men had experienced some of these behaviors. But it is very common for everyone. It's more common for women. It's common among people who identify as LGBTQI and not, and among frequent riders as well. So there's a lot going on this table. So let me just walk you through a little bit. So this is looking at our two different types of transit. So on the left, you have the experiences on the different parts of the bus journey, and on the right, you have the different parts of the rail journey. So how we asked this question is you saw that list of experiences, and then there was essentially a checkbox is that, if you've experienced this, where along the journey? There's a note at the bottom that says it kind of helps you interpret this table. Each cell is the percentage of that gender that had experienced that type of behavior at that place. So don't try to add anything to 100 because that's not how this table works. So you can see here the most common type of sexual harassment that in general were these verbal actions. That half of women experienced verbal harassment on their way to or from the bus. They experienced it most often while they were waiting for the bus, but also on the vehicle. You can also see that the experiences were more common in terms of on the bus than on the train, and were more common among women than men, although, it was not zero. The least likely types of experiences that people had were in terms of physical sexual harassment, but in no way is this meant to say that some of these are worse or better, but just to really understand the types of things that are happening and which may inform our responses to these experiences. The other point that I really want people to understand is that the vast majority of these experiences go unreported. So we look at all these different groups by demographics, in terms of gender, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and frequency of transit service. Essentially, you can say probably 90% of people did not report experiences when they happen. And when we asked people, for those that did report, they were not generally reporting to any type of authority. They were most typically reporting these experiences to friends or family. When we asked why they didn't report, it was a combination of things, but it kind of goes back to this point about that these experiences happen in public and that, it thought it was unlikely that the person would be caught. There were some things they didn't know how to report to. And I think by and large, it's kind of that people just wanted to move on. They did not want to relive this experience. And especially because most of these students ride transit a lot. You can understand how you don't necessarily want to dwell on this because this is just, part of how you get to where you need to go. So in terms of the policy response from this finding, it's really that we cannot expect to rely on reported statistics about these experiences as an indication of whether or not they actually occur. So these experiences not only shape perceptions, they also shape kind of the reactions to it. And again, this is really useful in terms of how we ask the question. We did not ask some people to say, do you take precautions? Because, I think that it's likely to say that no, either that's because you really don't feel like you do, or you don't want to say that you do. But once what we did is we asked about a series of very specific behaviors or responses they may have. And that's what you can see here. So I think if you have a conversation with someone like, oh, do you take precautions? Like, oh, the bus is dangerous is something someone might say. Oh, no, I feel fine. But if you really probe that, it's like, well, especially kind of thinking about women here, well, do you feel like you need to change out of your gym clothes before you get on the bus? Do you carry your keys in your hand? Do you only go to certain stops? Those types of behaviors, that's what we really found here. So that first part, about does safety affect mobility in terms of not using? So one of the highest precautions that women would take is only traveling during the daytime on transit, but also, avoiding stops. And that kind of goes with waiting for transit in well-lit places, waiting for transit other people are around, sitting close to the driver. These are much more common among women than men, although men also did take some precautions. So we also did a series of models to understand how we could control for various factors. I'm just going to talk briefly about a couple of those. The two models that we ran with our data, one was to look at the likelihood of being a victim for sexual harassment. We did separate models for bus and for the rail, for people that had traveled along those modes. And then we also modeled the determinants of perceptions of safety. We did 4 different models for that. So we did a bus during the day model, a bus at night, and similar rail at day and night. So these models essentially confirmed what we were already seeing in the descriptive results and what understandably you might think. So the variable that was most significantly associated with the likelihood of being a victim was being a woman. LGBTQI status was also significantly associated with an increased likelihood of victimization. In terms of the built environment, the existence of poor illumination, but also things that are not exactly built environment, but that are just characteristics. So the presence of vandalism and litter, panhandling or drunk people, and a longer commute. We asked people how long it took them to get to campus in terms of time, and that's what we used in that category. We had further confirmation of our results from our safety perception models. So the factors that were significantly related to feeling less safe at night, again, was being a woman. This was true in the rail and the bus and a combined model. It was most significant. Age is that for bus riders, older riders felt more unsafe, but again, we have a fairly narrow age bands in our responses. The being a victim of physical harassment also made you feel less safe at night. Poorly guarded or kind of empty stations. This is true on both the rail and the bus models. And again, some of these factors just kind of like what I would describe as unmaintained stops and stations. So, when there's trash or litter or graffiti, or essentially that like no one is taking care of this space, that did leave people to feel less safe at night. The only factor that was significant related to feeling safer at night was people who identified as white, and this was only in the bus model. Okay. So this research really demonstrated and I think confirmed a number of things that we understood to be true. Part of this research is really situated. So we conducted most of this research in 2018 and 2019. This was coming out of Me Too. There was also a great Washington Post article that said, the reality of Me Too is just like you've been a woman on public transit. So to a certain extent, we were not surprised by any of our findings, but it was really important for us to document this, to understand it at a disaggregated space, so that once we came to solutions, we'd kind of be very confident in the types of responses that we think would make a difference. So here I want to show you what our respondents said in terms of what they thought would make traveling by bus safer. And that the two things I think that are really critical, one is about lighting at bus stops, and the second is about frequent services. Now, there were a number of things that we learned during the process of this research that I think with hindsight, we'd go back and think about, kind of enhancing this list of options and maybe being more specific in terms of the police response. So I will, you can see on the left, the police patrolling bus stops was a recommended, but once we started to look at this based on race, ethnicity, it was less common to be recommended across the board. So I want to kind of transition now to talk a little bit about how this work looking at public transit kind of relates to a broader understanding and picture of what gendered transportation patterns look like, drawing from the work in terms of that was done at LA Metro and LA DOT. So LA Metro undertook the Understanding How Women Travel study. And the nice thing about both this and the follow-on work from LA DOT was that there was an opportunity to really build on the work. This came after we had finished the transit safety study, to look at a broader set of data to really kind of knit this together. So really kudos to the LA Metro team in terms of thinking about a lot of different ways that information on gender and transportation could be collected. So the first, and I'll show you one thing from that, was to look at data from the National Household Travel Survey. They also reviewed existing data that they had. They did find that also not a lot of their existing data actually collected information about gender to be able to disaggregate that. So the primary source of that was the onboard surveys that has been done for quite some time at LA Metro on a regular basis. They also conducted an online survey, and this went out to both transit riders and non-riders. There were 3 focus groups. There was also a really innovative, these last 3 are kind of the innovative methods that they did as part of the study. So did participant observation on buses, just to kind of understand like where do people physically sit? Are there patterns related to that? There were a number of participatory workshops among particular populations. So there's one among the unhoused community, there's one among the disability community, and one other that's not coming to the top of mind now. And then lastly, there was pop-up engagement. So at stations, there was just kind of a very simple approach where you asked a question and there were sticky notes that people could respond. Building on that, the LA DOT gender equity story had an opportunity to even dig in deeper. So the LA DOT work specifically focused on 3 distinct neighborhoods in Los Angeles. So this is Watts in South Los Angeles, Sun Valley, which is in the Northeast San Fernando Valley, and Sawtelle, which is a fairly dense community just to the west of UCLA. The primary data collection methods in this study was to collect community surveys, and then there's about 400 of those collected across these 3 neighborhoods, and to conduct travel interviews. This was a method that we had developed previously in studying older adults that really tried to get at information that you would through a household travel survey, but not really be onerous. I definitely recommend anyone who works with NHTS data or likes to, read about it, to actually try to collect your own travel diary, because you will get a great appreciation of the people who have spent time doing that. Because it is it is not easy. So rather than trying to do that, since we had a smaller sample, we essentially had a travel interview that walked through specific questions like, what was the last time you went to the grocery store? How did you get there? What time of day was it? Did you go somewhere else? You could kind of construct the travel patterns. We'll also say that we were completely set to do field data collection for the DOT study right when the pandemic happened. So there was a huge shift in this, and it's just really kudos to the consultant team for doing those switches. So both of these studies help to understand, to hammer the point home, that women's travel patterns are more complex than men's. So this really kind of helps to go to the first point, which is in the transit safety. There are really specific safety concerns that women have. But the other hand, their travel patterns are more complex. So there's more trip chaining, which is where you go from one destination to another and kind of create a loop. They're more typically to be escorting others, whether it be children or older adults, or just being caregivers. And they're likely to be carrying things for household duties. So grocery shopping or errands, or just physically shuttling other people around. And the thing that I think is really important to think about is that these things are not easy to do on transit. It is, it is just not the easiest or most convenient way to take transit, or to use a bicycle, or to walk, and so that there's, different modes could help for different purposes. So as we're kind of wrapping up here, I just want to have a couple of findings I think that will kind of help to draw all of this work together. So on the left is a chart from the LA Metro study, and this is drawing from the NHTS data. And that what you can see here is that for both men and women, most people drive. And actually, whether it be they're driving themselves or they're being driven by others, and that driving really provides a number of access benefits. And these access benefits are really apparent for low women of color. And there's a paper that my colleague Evelyn Blumenberg has published that really hammers the point about the access benefits of automobiles for low-income women. But what was interesting in terms of when we dug into this within these specific neighborhoods in the LADOT study is that not all women can actually benefit, that there are a number of upstream issues. So we asked people during the travel interviews whether they had a driver's license. And I think that here's where we start to see more of the kind of interactions of gender, race, and income. The Sawtell, which was the neighborhood that was the most white, highest density, and highest income, majority of people, both men and women, had driver's license, but not all. In Sun Valley, which is kind of more middle income, but the destinations are further apart, that you start to see more of a gap, that actually more men than women had driver's license. And in Watts, actually only half of the women that we talked to had a driver's license. So there's kind of two things to think about here. One is that if you don't have a driver's license, you're much more likely to be relying on public transit and walking and bicycling to a smaller extent to get around. But that also, there's a question about if we want to provide more the access benefits of cars, there are upstream issues relating to just driver's license access, and whose job is that to kind of address? So those are just kind of other things to think about. So what's been really useful in working in all of these projects is really understanding that making transportation better, both for women and gender minorities, requires both transit and transportation access improvements. These things really need to go together. So I want to wrap up with some specific recommendations about how people can address the findings that we saw across these studies. So first I want to talk about in the transit journey. there needs to be a hyper focus on the lack of lighting, to audit the lighting conditions and to think about where priority investments in lighting can be made. It's not easy to do this. It's much easier for me as an academic to say this needs to be done than it is for public agencies to address it. Because, you could think about, well, we need to look at the lighting conditions in terms of where we have the highest transit ridership, right? Because there's gonna be the most benefits. But if we go back to the precautions that people were taking, people were also avoiding certain stops because there wasn't lighting. So there's definitely a probably investment to be made on both sides and in general, just in terms of lighting. The other thing that I think is difficult, or is a bureaucratic complexity to think about, is that for a lot of cities, the majority of transit ridership is on the bus. This is true in Los Angeles, and it's true in a lot of places. And that transit agencies typically, do not have jurisdiction about lighting, right? But how can we think about trying to form partnerships to make sure that this issue is being addressed? Because we know it's something that transit riders are experiencing. The second one is to think about transit frequency. I have yet to come across an issue that has come up in terms of making transit better that frequency can't solve. The second one is to ensure real-time arrival information is accurate and easily available. The third recommendation is thinking about not just in terms of making transit come as often as possible and having lighting, is how can we actually activate stations and stops? So we saw that people were likely to wait at places with others, and really this kind of idea that just more people not feeling so isolated really helps people feel safer. So, in Los Angeles, we have a really vibrant street vendor community. And, I've been waiting to kind of speak to personal experiences. I've waited, at transit stops at night, and I was like, just thought about how street vendors, provide a service, but also just in terms of like, you can buy a snack, but also just like, it's another person that's standing there. But I think there are great international examples about, things like dance groups at night or other ways to just activate public space during the night, and to actually also think about these conditions. The other thing that we have suggested and found to be promising is targeted bystander campaigns. So this does really come to specific how they're designed. But the general idea about this is that people can make other people feel safe just by talking to them. So if someone is being harassed, rather than talking to the person doing the harassing, there's evidence that just intervening and talking to the person that is actually being harassed and striking up a conversation and kind of deflecting that really has a lot of promise. And speaking to kind of the broader issues around transportation access, I think the LADOT study really helped to understand differences in needs in communities of different types and how kind of transportation interventions can be targeted. Because in low and medium density neighborhoods, there are longer travel distances. A scooter is not going to be, as an example, a useful approach when you're traveling 5, 6, 7 miles. So we can think about different interventions kind of relating to the land use and build form. The other thing that came up as a recommendation in LADOT work is to consider point-to-point transportation offerings. And this is just kind of like thinking about on-demand shuttles that connect under-resourced communities to regional destinations. So we saw that the main trips that women weren't making were to recreational. And like the women in South LA, I really wanted to go to the beach. It is shocking how the travel distances to our regional destinations, mountains and the beaches, are just really difficult. We can also think about ways to support existing behaviors. So like giving money to people who give each other rides. This comes up in work I've looked at in terms of transportation access to healthcare. There's opportunities for car access programs to fill mobility gaps. So in Los Angeles, we have an electric car sharing program called Blue LA. And it's important to think about upstream issues like lack of money, driver's license, and societal burdens that really make, that show up in transportation that need to be addressed. All right, so I just want to hammer home these 3 points and I look forward to your questions. So the first kind of final thought is that improving public transportation for women and gender minorities is necessary, it's important, it shouldn't be overlooked, frankly shouldn't have taken till this long to really think about addressing it, but it's critically important. The second kind of conclusion I want to leave you with is that addressing gender transportation needs requires improving transportation access broadly, and that intersectional approaches are essential. If you are only looking at gender and you're not looking at gender and race or gender and income, you are likely only looking at the most privileged women. So with that, I want to thank you so much and look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you so much. We've got a few questions that have already come in, and then I want to remind everyone you can type some more into the Q&A feature, and great, the link to the report on this has Maddie put it in, so wonderful, and the book. So I'm just going to start at the top in terms of questions. Did the survey ask whether people felt safer while they were traveling with another person?
So that's a good question. So no, we didn't. So it did not ask specifically, like, do you, like, in a way you'd get at that, it's like, do you go to or come from transit with anyone else? What people did say is that they felt safer waiting with other people. So there's some, I think, evidence in our findings that relate to other people make other people feel safe. But no, we didn't get at that specifically. And our survey, because we were looking at university students, these were not generally people who were traveling with children, caregiving, just kind of based on their age.
Yeah, I did on your slide that had sort of the behavior changes there, and maybe that's where the waiting with people. So there at least one or two of those like behavior responses had to do with being with other people. So maybe not directly,
exactly.
but indirectly.
Yeah, so one of the precautions, I think what you're speaking to is, one of the precautions that people took was waiting for transit only if other people were around.
Okay.
So that's where that comes from.
Okay. And a little bit related to this, someone has asked about sort of historical trends on transit safety for women. And this person did a master's thesis a few decades ago and wonders if things have changed, and maybe is thinking that they haven't changed as much as one would hope. And so have you seen any more historical data, or have any transit agencies collected more data over time?
So LA Metro has been, so on their onboard rider surveys, they did add a question relating to harassment. And they've been asking that question. It's not at all, I mean, it's maybe been the last 4 or 5 years. So it's fairly recent. They did see some changes in terms of increases, but because it's a cross-sectional survey, it's really hard to say whether it's people are experiencing it more. I think that a lot of this comes out of the fact that, like, in early 20th century, late 19th century, like, if you were a woman in public, you were a sex worker. And that, like, historically women were not supposed to be seen in public, and so that there's this, and this is very much not my specialty, and I'm so kind of, pulling from great presentations, people that do this work, but I think that women being harassed is a long-standing issue, and it really is derived from the fact that kind of historical women's places in the home type thing. So I don't at all think this is a new issue. I just think we've really lacked the data to demonstrate that it has been an issue for a long time, specifically in transit. I imagine there are people in other disciplines that have looked at this. Probably, I just don't know that work.
So I'm going to throw my own question in, because you mentioned LA's, adding this to their survey, and I do know that agency and a few other agencies have implemented a variety of programs to try to address this issue in particular of harassment, sexual harassment, gendered on transit. And I'm wondering what your perspective, if you've seen any evidence of the success of those types of programs or how well they work.
So right now, so we finished up the Understanding How Women Travel report in 2019. LA Metro is finishing the action plan, which is the follow-up to that. And those results, I just saw a board motion, are going to be kind of presented to the board in the spring in a couple of months. So there have been some things, but they've been relatively ad hoc, I would describe them as, in terms of LA. So I don't think we're there yet in terms of a real evaluation. And I think that it'd be really important to actually follow the same people to understand whether individuals feel like things have gotten better or changed, because I think that it's really hard when we have these cross-sectional onboard surveys to actually say, well, has things changed? Are we talking to different people? Because we know that the experiences are very different. I will say that kind of in relationship to the frequency issue, we have less bus service now in Los Angeles than we did, I think, in the 90s. I was just seeing someone else crunching that. And so I actually, I think that there's a need to, LA Metro is going to have to think about both adopting some of the programs that they're intentionally pursuing in the action plan, as well as dealing with some of the underlying issues with transit frequency to really address this.
All right. So let me go back to some of the questions from our viewers. Has LA Metro used an app like Safety Pin to aggregate reports where physical infrastructure improvements such as lighting are most needed? So is there a way for riders to give some feedback?
So there is a reporting hotline, which is not to the infrastructure part. I'll come back to that. And we also did, as part of this safety study, we did interviews with transit agencies that were serving the students that we talked to, including the people that run the hotline. And they were actually wondering whether Metro was even advertising the hotline because they were receiving so few reports. And so I think there's been some challenges to actually just kind of get people to talk about these things. They have not, there's a kind of a jurisdictional issue, I would say, in terms of especially related to lighting, or even like trash pickup and things like that. Those are all the responsibility of local municipalities. So in the city of Los Angeles, if you're riding transit in the city of Los Angeles, those types of things you'd more likely to report them through the 311 app, where you can report that there's lighting. But no, I do not think that they have a pretty robust station evaluation program where they go to all of the rail, heavy and light rail stations and do inspections on those. I do not believe that that program also extends to the bus. And so, yeah, I think it's a great idea to figure out how you easily allow people to speak to municipalities or transit agencies about where they see problems, because especially in Los Angeles, the scale of our transit service is really big. And so being able to crowdsource some of that information has a real opportunity.
Great. I'm jumping around a little bit for things that are related in terms of question time. So related to lighting, what are your thoughts on security cameras and effectiveness of that?
So let me just go to like what our respondents said, because we did specifically ask about that. And I'll say that the lighting was more recommended than cameras either on the bus or at bus stops. And so I think it kind of relates to this issue of why people don't report, because they don't feel like people will be caught or kind of anything will be done. And so there's a question about, there's probably a question that could be researched about the effectiveness, the kind of response to the existence of cameras. But the question is like, are you just putting up a camera so that people feel like they are being watched? Or are you actually using things to make changes or address issues? I will say that as they've been rolling out new buses in the LA Metro bus stock, they do have screens like that actually show kind of other passengers, and it'd be curious to survey riders to see whether they feel like those improvements have made a difference.
I think that makes sense. I think I can squeeze in these last two questions that are already here. So this one question has to do with the fact that with bus network redesigns and stop rebalancing, that may mean that people have to actually walk farther to a bus stop and perhaps have more transit or transfers, sorry. And so any thoughts on how those strategies might intersect with this research?
Yeah, I mean, so LA Metro did our bus redesign called the Next Gen plan that has been rolled out. I think now has actually gone through the actual service changes. It has kind of coincided with pandemic disruptions to the transit service. So it's been a little bit of bumpy ride. I want to kind of give them credit for a lot of things that are outside of their control. I thought I was also on a advisor or a service council kind of relating to bus rider issues at the time. And I did highlight to staff that, if you increase transfers that are not well timed, you have women waiting more and it makes it harder. The idea about these bus redesigns with more transfers is that it's not just more transfers, but it's paired with better frequency so that you aren't waiting as much, because it's important to recognize that people felt safer on the vehicle than waiting or getting to or from. But I think that's a good opportunity to interject a strategy that I think is a pretty relatively low cost, easy one, is the idea of courtesy stops at night. So it's not necessarily on the transfer, but just on kind of trying to reduce that walking. So, and I want to say the 80s, in the city of Toronto, they did a courtesy stop program for women that they could request to get let off the bus at night at places that weren't a stop, to reduce that walking. And it was so popular that actually anyone was able to do it, and it's still a program to this day. So I think looking for opportunities to try to reduce both waiting and walking distances have a lot of promise.
Great. And then going back to sort of programs, you mentioned some things that LA Metro has done in terms of programs to try to reduce or address harassment. And are you aware, would you point to other examples at other agencies, cities, regions that you think might be models? I know maybe the evidence may or may not be out there yet.
So WMATA in the DC region has, I think, a fairly successful in terms of it being used. model where they had a text to report. They have a text to report. Very simple technology. Like I think agencies should get away from apps, frankly. They're just one more thing you have to download on your phone. So it's just real lower barrier to entry. And it was so like popular that like people were just reporting emergencies. They're like, there's a heart attack. Someone's having a heart attack on this train. But you know, it was really quick. They responded. People saw the response. I think that is a great model to watch out for.
Great. So thank you very much. We got to all the questions that I saw that came in. So I always appreciate that. Great questions and great answers. And I am going to share my screen as we wrap up here. First of all, I want to thank you, Madeline, for a great presentation that I will be sharing broadly and use in classes and things like that in the future. For those of you who are watching, I want to remind you that there's a very short survey after you close your screen, and we'd love to get your feedback. And if you do not already, please sign up for our monthly newsletters so you can hear about more of these seminars, and including upcoming spring Friday transportation seminars, which later on in the term, we do plan on going back to our hybrid in-person and live webcasting format. So with that, I want to thank everyone, thank Madeline and all of you who are out there watching and participating. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, everyone.